On behalf of Observer Research Foundation, I welcome you all to this book discussion that we're having today online. We'll be discussing a book, China's Search for National Rejuvenation, Domestic and Foreign Policies under Xi Jinping. We have with us today the book's co-editor, Dr. Jebin Jacob, and Dr. Roger Liu, and Dr. Prachi Agarwal, who have contributed chapters to the volume. Dr. Jebin Jacob is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shiv Nada University. Dr. Prachi Agarwal is an assistant professor of Sanchi University of Buddhist Indic Studies. Dr. Roger Liu is an associate professor of international politics and the director, Center for South and Southeast Asia Studies, Flame University in Maharashtra. To discuss the book, we have Dr. Rityusha Tiwari. Rityusha Tiwari is the visiting fellow of Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi. She is also an assistant professor of the Shahid Bhagat Singh College in Delhi. The book, China's Search for National Rejuvenation, elaborates on issues related to China's economic reforms, its governance, its diplomacy. The volume offers our readers a better idea of China's place in the world as the Chinese themselves see it. Before we start our discussion today, let me remind our viewers to send in their questions via the Q&A box that they see on their screens. So now, without further ado, I call upon Dr. Jebin Jacob to tell us what this book is all about. Over to you, Dr. Jacob.
Thank you, Kalpit, and thank you to the ORF for hosting this discussion, and to my thanks also to Dr. Rityusha Tiwari for taking time out to serve as discussant. And my thanks to my contributors who are part of the panel today, as well as other panel contributors who are also part of the audience. Let me also thank many of the audience who sort of sent in messages of congratulations on social media and other channels. The book actually came out in the middle of last year, but of course we were all more than a little distracted at that time. And I have about 8 minutes allotted to me, and what I'm going to try and do in the 8 minutes allotted to me is to give you 3 unique selling propositions of this book and about 5 insights as to why this book is important and why you should read this book. So in the 3 USPs, number 1, it's an all-Asian cast. If you actually look back or think about what was the last book on China, an edited volume that you read that wasn't written by a Westerner, it's quite difficult for many of us to sort of think of one. Or what was not, completely written only by Indians. It's just not too many books out there. So what I'd like to remind everybody is that, there is quality work happening on China that takes place in China's neighbors. After all, they're the ones that are most immediately affected by China. And so we have Indians and we have Vietnamese writing for this book, as well as the Taiwanese and the Malaysian scholar. So that's the first point. The second USP, I think, is that all the authors are China-wallahs or China professionals. They are not non-China specialists. So all of us actually make our bread and butter researching or teaching about China professionally. And therefore, the insights that come to you from this book are accordingly framed and structured. Third, the book delves into, of course, all the usual areas, foreign policy and so on, but it also looks at a few issues that are not usually covered in books on China or on Chinese foreign policies. Number 1 is about propaganda, the Communist parties of China's propaganda system and how it operates abroad. The other have to do with the economics side of things. Issues such as innovation, rural vitalization, and the role of state-owned enterprises, all of these issues and how they impact Chinese foreign policy. So this, I think, is, these 3 points, I think, are very important to keep in mind as unique points about this particular book. Now, in terms of the insights, the 5 insights that particularly stand out, I think, in this book. Number one, the authors, given their background in China studies, the authors frame their approach to looking at whatever themes that they pick up in this book, foreign policy or science and tech or economy, from the point of view that the bedrock of anything to do with China is its domestic politics. So the bedrock is China's domestic politics, and hence you see the title, the expression national rejuvenation. And this, therefore, we come to respective topics from belief, from the fact, not just a belief, not just a guess, that Chinese foreign policy is driven by Chinese domestic politics. It's not just a great game. It's not just a wish to teach Vietnam or India a lesson. I mean, these are, of course, add-ons. But the fact that all of these issues are driven, or all of these events are driven by Chinese domestic politics. Number two, national rejuvenation is also about the Chinese model, and which is the connection between domestic politics and foreign policy. It's about selling the Chinese model to the outside world. So if China does something well at home, China is no longer shy about proclaiming it to the outside world. And this link between domestic politics and the impact of domestic politics and on foreign policy is actually getting stronger. So this is something, again, that we'd like to underline. The next insight is really about, again, domestic politics in China has, of course, shifted to greater centralization and one leader rule. That is why we have the name Xi Jinping also in the title. Now, this is not new. But what the authors argue is also that the foundation of nearly all domestic politics is economics. So there are insights. So there are insights on the role of economic development, of economic structures, of political considerations into making economic decisions. All of these are also part of the insights that we provide in this particular book. And just the last but one point is that in foreign policy, none of the authors are sanguine at all about China's intentions or plans. Those of us who study China full-time and look at Chinese domestic politics, Chinese domestic economic situation, nearly all of them agree that China's foreign policy will become increasingly problematic, increasingly assertive, even aggressive over time. So there are considerations that people who negotiate with China need to take into account before they get into negotiations. I mean, we just saw that the European Union has concluded an investment treaty with the Chinese in the hopes that they will be able to change or reform Chinese behavior. So one of the insights that will come from this book is that, I mean, if you read this book, we haven't discussed the European Union, but if you read this book, I think you will come to the decision or come to the conclusion that the European Union has actually made a mistake, right? Final point is that the Chinese, and this is something that we cannot stress strongly enough, that the Chinese take a whole of the system approach. Foreign policy, domestic policy, military, we have a chapter on the military as well, science and tech, state-owned enterprises, none of these are compartmentalized. They're all linked to each other. One of the issues that we have not really looked at very strongly in this book, but which is something that I would say is very important going forward, is the closer fusion between the military and the civilian sectors in China. And we said before that economics is the bedrock, but now politics, economics, and military are all getting fused together increasingly strongly. And, so with these 5 insights and these 3 USPs, this is what I'd like to sort of stop here. Because time is limited, I'd like to hand it over back to Kalpit. Thank you so much for your attention and for joining us for this meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. And as people who've kind of studied Chinese studied China, you realize that the scientific and technological development has been a very important component of the Chinese Communist Party strategy. Each generation of the party's leadership has sought to make China an technology superpower. And in the pursuit of this ambition, really, China has been able to mobilize both its private and state-owned enterprises. At a time, China is concentrating also on the development of its rural regions and transforming farming communities. So we have today with us Dr. Prachi Agarwal, who will help us understand how this all is being done. So over to you, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you, Kalpit. Good evening, everyone. The theme that I'm going to read here out is about the economic development and foreign policy. And in this section, I'm actually covering 3 chapters. One that is by Dr. Nguyen Minh Kiang, who is dealing with S&T, Science and Technology. The other is by Dr. Prachi Agarwal, dealing with agriculture. And the third one is about state-owned enterprises and reforms of state-owned enterprises by Dr. Arvind Yellary. And the underlying theme of all these 3 chapters, despite being of varied backgrounds, is about innovation and the stress of innovation in 19th CPC as well as the foreign policy. So starting with the S&T chapter by Dr. Giang, he's talking about its linkage of the scientific and technological innovations with gaining global leadership. And he's discussing how the definition of superpower has changed with China, who are now not only focusing about being rich, but also about moving closer to the central stage. It is now less about political application, but more about economic application. He stresses on that how the 10th five-year plan saw the specific emphasis on S&T through launch of various projects like medium and long-term plan for S&T development, declaration of China's National Innovation Driven Development Strategy by 17th CPC Congress, as well as the 18th CPC Central Committee, which argues that innovation will be called as one of the primary drivers of development. Even the 13th five-year plan has focused on the national plan for specifically linking science and technology as well as innovation. He then moves on to discuss about the commercialization of S&T capability, the artificial intelligence aspects, and how China is almost becoming at par with US in that field, where Python is the leading enterprise. Then in quantum information science, where China is likely to catch up with US once the US investment starts destabilizing. In the aspect of supercomputing, China is already owning 2 world's fastest supercomputers and also plans to put into operation next-gen computers by 2020, much before US. Also, China owns, given the data of 2017, has 207 most powerful supercomputers, which is much more than the US, as US has 143. In the field of biotechnology, government funding is there, world's largest genetics restructuring technology companies is there, which are promoting gene technology and scientific publications in that field. Phones, we have, in the phone industry, we have Huawei and Xiaomi as the leading enterprises. ZTE is also leading in designing and manufacturing networks. In the field of robotics, we have civilian and military cooperation, as Jabin was just suggesting. And state funding for these robotic companies is encouraged, especially if they acquire foreign technology. Nanotechnology, cloud computing are also being heavily state funded. Space industry, again, we saw the launch of Wukong Explorer in 2015. In aircraft field, China has manufactured the first commercial aircraft, COMOCAP, the indigenous aircraft, C919, which is likely to compete with Boeing, the Boeing series and the Airbus series. In marine technology, again, Tianlong submersible can dive up to 7,000 meters, and BYD has become the major producer of electric cars after Tesla. So we can see that China is actually heavily focusing and investing in the S&T aspects and the various S&T aspects, And Xi speech as rejuvenation has been used 29 times in the 19 CPC, and he's planning that globally to become a global leader in innovation, Chuangxin as they call it, by 2035, and become a global leader in international influence by 2049, and upgradation of national industries in competing in medium high-end industries, and modernization of world-class defense into a world-class force by 2035. Interestingly, this concept of innovation had begun during the time of Jiang Zemin, who was the one who had appointed Xi Jinping as his successor. And since then, innovation has been a continuous word in the presidential speeches, in the speeches of all the presidents who have been then since then. Special emphasis has been made on Made in China 2025, who are again planning on indigenous innovation and control of core technologies. For this, Xi has proposed a two-stage goal. One, to develop China into a moderately prosperous society by 2021 and a global leader by 2035. So for this purpose, where the technology innovation is integrated into economic development, Xi Jinping had suggested six tasks to be done by the Chinese economy. One is integration of artificial intelligence. Second is encouragement of basic research in applied sciences, innovation in key generic technologies. Third is encouraging collaboration amongst enterprises and research institutes. Fourth, encouraging creation, protection, and application of intellectual property. Fifth, developing of military intelligence and ability to fight under dimensional conditions. And lastly, occupying the strategic high ground in terms of S&T innovation. So China is basically focusing on developing indigenous core technologies rather than focusing on the import of foreign technology. So this is what the author discusses in terms of S&T, at how China has shifted its focus from import of technology to building up of indigenous technology through innovation and encouraging civilian and military collaboration in this aspect. The second chapter dealt with rural vitalization and foreign policy. Rural vitalization is called Xiangcun Zhenxing in the Chinese, and which has become the main priority. Xi, right from his first tenure, has been heavily emphasizing that Chinese food should be linked with Chinese prestige and it should be in Chinese hands. And he wants to turn China into a major investor of agriculture in other countries. So this concept of Chinese dream was first used by Colonel Liu Mingfu, and he has, for China, according to him, Chinese dream should be moving on from hiding capabilities, biding time, to forging ahead. That is from Tao Kuang Yang Hui to Fan Fa You Wei. So China wants to take the center stage now and is stressing on innovation in agricultural technology domestically and investments in foreign policy to seek both the product as well as the process. As we all know, food has become the core national interest of China, and Xi has suggested a two-pronged strategy for this purpose. One, to buy technology from developed nations, and the other is to buy land from developing or underdeveloped nations. So rural revitalization, it involves development of agriculture in rural side, and Xi wants to basically re-establish the version 2.0 of Back to Countryside, where instead of sending the urban intellectuals, Xi is looking forward to sending the factories to establish bases in rural areas and encourage factory employment and prevent the migration of laborers. So these factories, which will be established, their bases in rural areas, are called satellite factories, and they solve the issue of income, they solve the issue of employment, as well as solve the issue of unattended children and crops. So it becomes basically a win-win situation where the farmer can stay with his family, tend to crops, and have a steady income during the off season. The factory people, they get to pay lower salaries. The satellite factories, entrepreneurs get to pay lower factories in rural areas, as well as they get government assistance in building up infrastructure and recruitment. The government gets to win brownie points, as well as dissipate the effect of overheated economy in that area, and also helps the fourth-class cities of China to enter as the new consumers and assist new consumers of China and assist in poverty alleviation program. Yet, rural vitalization strategy is not all happy, as it has its cons of challenges of food security, especially because China's arable land is already falling below the red line, and given the challenge of satellite factories, much of arable land is now becoming places for commercial establishments, and land grab is becoming a common phenomenon. In case of 19th CPC and agriculture, domestically, CPC has again focused on innovation and solving the problem of Sannong Banthi, as they call it, which is the problem of farmers, the problem of rural areas, and the problem of agriculture. They want to encourage online retailers to develop internet infrastructure and e-commerce to link rural producer with the urban consumer. Li Keqiang too, in his 2015 government work report, had argued for an internet plus agriculture. And China Development Forum, it's a forum where the government machinery, the military, the civilians, and the intellectuals collaborate and discuss on issues. This is organized by State Council. They held a session on rural vitalization to stress the importance of this issue in 2018. And they wanted to focus on market connectivity, infrastructure, education, R&D, and supply side structural reforms. Now, when I say supply side structural reforms, it means better grain storage, better production and quality oriented production, as well as better environment. When we say concept of China in the new era, or the Chinese dream, we could talk about investment in agriculture as a main priority and the integration of agricultural and rural development. That is why Ministry of Agriculture has been renamed as Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, and shift has come from targeted production approach to economic and environmental efficiency. NDRC has incorporated the theme of Wu-Wei-Yi-Ti, as they call it, which highlights the following aspects: the economic construction, the political construction, cultural construction, social construction, and ecological construction, which means that in terms of economic construction, farmer cooperatives and rural industries or agri-based industries get an impetus to be established. In terms of political
Dr. Agarwal request you to kind of begin, wrapping up your, just in the interest of, meeting the time.
Okay. Just give me 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Political construction, which would involve eliminating grassroots level corruption and integrating at the grassroots level the party members. Then cultural construction would involve a development of tangible and intangible heritage, and social construction would involve educating about new trends and improvisation on backward thinking. And ecological construction would involve sanitization and village grievances. In terms of foreign policy, we have that China's agricultural policy has been heavily linked with the BRI factor, and China's ODI in agriculture has also jumped almost 5 times from 2010 to 2016 to up to $3.3 billion. And this is also called the third wave of investment, where China has shifted from South-South cooperation or acquiring of technology in developed areas to an area where China wants to help the private enterprises lead the way in investment in foreign areas. The third chapter that I have is all about state-owned enterprises as agents of party and state power by Dr. Arvind Yellary.
Dr. Agarwal, that's 30 seconds more. Please begin.
Yeah, sure. Please. So it speaks about resuscitating SOEs through 3 innovation-driven strategies, and SOEs are trying to engage in aggressive mergers and acquisitions to dispel the redundancy. But SASAC has launched the 4 reforms pilot program, which involves restructuring of capital assets, mixed ownership on a pilot basis, micro-analysis of management, and installation of discipline, inspection groups. So it speaks about how the SOEs, Xi Jinping wants the SOEs to lead the way in developing in innovation and in foreign policy, in emerging as the major models of Chinese wisdom, which are not only globally professional but also are politically under the control of the party. So it talks about how the SOEs should be how the government wants the SOEs to be treated as an international player, but because of bureaucracy and insufficient R&D, they are facing problems. So in order to solve these problems, a state-owned venture capital fund under the aegis of State Council has been established with the total of 200 billion yuan to assist the SOEs in acquiring innovation technology. And more SOEs are now being linked up with the BRI initiative to reform as an infrastructure investors and to ensure survival in an innovation-driven world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Agarwal. We've all seen that Beijing has been embarking on this whole information war in a desperate attempt to revive its global image amid the pandemic. China has seized the opportunity to provide relief to some countries as a part of its PR offensive aimed at polishing the Communist Party's image. The Chinese Communist Party has ties with about 600 political parties from 160 nations, making it one of the few political outfits that devote so much time to party diplomacy. I call upon another speaker today, Dr. Roger Liu, to demystify the Chinese propaganda strategy. Over to you, Dr. Liu.
Thank you, Kapit. Please cut me off if I stop time. Okay, so I'm going to cover two chapters here. One is written by myself. The other is written by Peter Miao of the University of Malaya. And Professor Peter talks about the role that the Chinese Communist Party plays using the party-to-party relationship to actually promote propaganda. All right. Okay, so let me cut off something. Okay. Well, I will use the privilege to talk about my chapters first. My chapter covers, and then I will go to Peter's chapter. My chapter actually is about how BRI has enhanced the grand overseas propaganda machine of China, or 大外宣, that China has launched in the late and middle 1990s, which is lasts quite a long time, almost 30 years. China has tried to sell itself to promote its image since the 1990s and by aiming at some foreign audiences. But this kind of efforts had not been working really well because, well, during the 1990s, this kind of strategy is just like in the dots. They didn't connect the dots and make it bigger. And during that time, the Chinese propaganda machine and the Chinese Communist Party has adopted more like a defensive strategy. Because after 1989, China has been facing a lot of pressure from the embargoes imposed by the Western countries as a result of the Tiananmen Square incident. So they are trying to adopt a defensive posture to make a breakthrough of this, the West, make the breakthrough regarding the West offensive and the embargo from the outside. So this is when the grand overseas propaganda began. And after that, well, the Chinese Communist Party and the government of China are becoming more and more open, and they engage into several other well, after Jiang Zemin, and then comes Hu Jintao, and China was hosting the Olympic Games, and this is the second wave that China tried to sell its own image to the international audiences through the opportunity of the Beijing Olympics. But even during that time, they still focus more on the constructing of their media strategies and capabilities. So during the time, the Chinese Communist Party tried to acquire more local radio or TV stations, especially with the focus in African countries. And then they tried to level out the collaboration with some foreign partners, trying to, if we use Xi Jinping's word, of course, during the Hu Jintao's time, there was no such term, to tell a good Chinese story. But it was not very successful until, according to me, the launch of the BRI. The launch of BRI actually plays a very important role by putting everything all together. First, the power of a party, the strength of a party got leveled up under Xi Jinping's leadership. And the second thing is that BRI actually provides some of the persuasive examples that the Chinese Communist Party and the government of China can use to persuade the audience of its interest. And the third thing is that BRI actually provide a platform for which the CCP can use. By combining with the platform, they can combine the media portals, the higher institutions like the universities, and bringing a new player. And according in my chapter, I labeled it as the SOE, the state-owned enterprises. Actually, is the key in China's BRI that plays a role of the propaganda. State-owned enterprises actually provides more capabilities that that most of the media portals cannot do, because the state-owned, the SOEs actually, first, they are more infiltrative, right? They are more infiltrating into the hosting countries' social and economic situations, because they are stationed there. They make contact with local people. They hire local people to understand what's happening on the ground, and at the same time, well, when various projects has been carried out by those big SOEs, such as the China Communication Construction Company, CCCC, and its subsidiaries like China Harbor Engineering Company, CCHEC, and there's another one, China Road and Bridge Corporation, or CRBC. All these are very large. Even CCCC is the largest contractor for construction projects in the world, right? So actually, CCCC has more strength than all the other propaganda arms that the Chinese Communist Party can send out overseas. It can provide the money. It can be more persuasive by hiring the people, and one important role that those SOEs can play is that it can be the censor or the tentacle of the Chinese Communist Party, because it is so infiltrative that it can collect all the data, all the socioeconomic data from the hosting nations, and this data can be used for the making and adjustment of China's BRI, as well as the propaganda, the GOP, or the grand overseas propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party. So to put it short, I would say that China's 大外宣 or GOP has not been completed until the launch of BRI in 1913/1915. And by combining together, actually China has been launching a stronger offensive through the help of BRI, and the combination and invention and application of new players like SOE actually make the can actually fulfill the GOP or 大外宣 plan that it has planned 30 years before. And for Peter's chapter, he talks about the role that the CCP plays by developing party-to-party relations to better propagate its agenda, especially in BRI. And after I read part of the chapter, and I would like to combine that with my own commentary as well. He's talking about the role of the international department or international liaison department of the CCP, and Peter used the case especially between China and Malaysia, that in recent years, especially after the 19th Party Congress, the Chinese Communist Party has leveled up and strengthened the inter-party connections between itself and different political parties in Malaysia. And according to Peter, his argument includes some of the following point. He thinks that the party-based diplomacy works because the party actually plays some roles that the MOFA or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China cannot play. First, the CCP is more infiltrative because the CCP can reach into this nation, into the country, and to make contact with some important leaders in aspects like or social groups like NGO or in the business, especially if you take into consideration of the fact that actually there's 1/4 of the Chinese population in Malaysia, and some of these people are immigrants from China, and they still have some kind of sentiments towards the father country. So to approach these people using some kind of nationalistic sentiment and from the party actually has some kind of attractions, all right, to do this kind of diplomacy. And the second thing is that the party can reach to the political elites and identify those VIPs who can actually play some important roles in the making of the national policy. Peter's in the conclusion, Peter thinks that the party-based diplomacy launched by and carried out by the International Liaison Department actually deliver much of what he expect of it. He focused, like I said, the case of China and Malaysia, but I want to raise some questions, and one of my thoughts after reading that. I will say that the role that CCP can play using the party diplomacy can somewhat be limited if you try to apply this model to other cases, for example, in India, because as we can see that, well, the party-based diplomacy that CCP tried to launch towards India is not very successful, has not been very successful even after the thawing period in the 1980s when they first approached the National Congress. And the Chinese scholars has written about this as well. And
Dr. Liu, can you kind of start wrapping up, because we have the discussion too, who will.
I see. Okay. And so I will say that, well, Peter actually has provided an interesting model of party-based diplomacy focused on Malaysia, and I think it will be more interesting if we can bring this model to examine different cases to see how CCP can actually play the role of diplomacy by strengthening the relationship, the inter-party relationship especially. Thank you.
Yeah, I thank all the authors for their presentations, and I now call upon the discussant for this book discussion, Dr. Tiwari, to give her take on the book, and post which I think there have been a couple of questions. So I think post Dr. Tiwari's presentation, we can take some of the questions from the audience. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Tiwari.
Thank you, Kalpit. Thank you for having me over to discuss this really insightful volume. First of all, my congratulations are in order for the editors, Dr. Jabin and Dr. Huang Thean, as also to the authors that we have today in the panel, Prachi, Roger, and others. I quite enjoyed reading the volume. some of the strengths of this book actually include the fact that there is no book on national rejuvenation in the last 14-15 years. So this is one of the trailblazers in that sense. So congratulations again. Also, there's been a lot written about China Dream, but how that China Dream would be manifest on the ground is something that is through national rejuvenation. And I think a volume that attempts to sort of unravel and unpack some of the issues that go into the making of China Dream by way of national rejuvenation was very timely. So this book comes in good time in that sense. Having said that, I kept on going through the chapters one after the other, and some of the very remarkable things included, as also Jabin pointed out, as one of the strengths of the book, that some of the issues explored are not something that other authors have sort of ventured to connect with foreign policy. For instance, the emphasis of Chinese Communist Party on SOEs. I mean, it's always seen as a challenge, but how that challenge actually comes into play when it's about deciding the foreign policy of China. How do SOEs prevent or strengthen that kind of foreign policy approach in various overtures? Another thing that I kind of found really striking was this entire balancing thing that China tries to play out through BRI projects, or in terms of trying to manage its image. It's not just a management tool, but also the way they are looking at managing their own domestic challenges. So the way propaganda is balanced in terms of catering to the audience outside the territory as well as to the audience within the territory, that becomes very important. And in this regard, the book throws at me few questions which I would like to sort of maybe see in the second edition of this book, if the authors are already not working on it. So the first theme that I would like to really read more about is about the issues of the margins. For instance, issues of laborers and migrant workers. And we've seen that how it has played out in pandemic. We've seen some of the studies which have covered that kind of a challenge that the party faced, and how they serve as some of the vantage points of deciding certain policies. Whether there are narratives of protest by the workers, by the labor force, that kind of reach from offshore and also from within the country, reach to the policy making halls of CPC, and whether they have any impact at all. The second thing within this kind of voices from the margin that I would also like to sort of read a bit more is whether gender discourse has entered into this whole idea of foreign policy making. We know certain countries have a kind of outlook which is very feminist foreign policy, if you will. I mean, if you look at Sweden in their own sort of way, in their own national policy papers, they have managed to put themselves as feminist foreign policy countries. So is that kind of a thing? Is that kind of a thing finding any resonance at all in China, or is it still gender opaque in some sense? So a bit more about women's participation when it comes to these hardcore areas of policy making, like foreign policy and deciding regional strategies of cooperation and engagement and so on and so forth. So material disparity on one hand, and then the disparity through these lenses, gender, region, class, so on and so forth. So where we bring the workers in. So this is the first theme which I feel could be there in the second volume of this entire project, because this is a project, and the book throws again another question. I mean, I sit back and I relax and I start looking at this whole idea of national rejuvenation from the eyes of these authors. And the first question that came to me was about these voices from the margin. The second question was, which phase of national rejuvenation do I keep China in? I mean, if national rejuvenation is happening, and if one could sort of evolve a kind of scale where you could put China either in the beginning or in some kind of a mid-scale position, or in some advanced, phase of national rejuvenation. And then what kind of implications can we draw about China's further trajectory, about its international behavior or its international relations, both locally and globally in that sense. So that's something that I found could serve as another vantage point for, taking forward this book from here. The third thing that I would like to read, again, based on the way authors have tried to put in their perspectives about various issues, is what is the implication about China's national rejuvenation in all of these arenas with regards to rule-based governance and specifically international governance. Because we also see at one hand how territoriality has come to play a huge role in both maintaining the propaganda at home and how China now decides to sort of interact and engage or disengage with its neighbors regionally and with other actors outside the region as well. So rule-based governance, and if there are any implications on that through this national rejuvenation prism of looking at things. And again, I don't know if we can add it here, but the crisis of faith that the political system in China sort of had to face in, say, 1989, post Tiananmen Square. Do you think that pandemic and, Xi Jinping's phase, I don't know if we can call it Xi Jinping's phase, but Xi Jinping's phase of, Chinese politics, do we see a crisis of faith in the making? Can we say that there is going to be too much of pressure now on China to sort of respond to all of these things, pandemic on one hand, and the kind of aggression that China has faced owing to pandemic and also owing to its overtures on territoriality and so on and so forth. And that crisis of faith, is it going to, there has been a crisis of faith in international community with regards to that, but is it going to be reflected domestically as well for Chinese Communist Party? That's something that I find fascinating. I think that the authors here could attempt in this direction as well. So the broad contours of challenges and strengths are very well captured in the book. And in that sense, I feel that the final task that a book of this stature can actually take on is perhaps, and it has already in some sense captured a part of it, what I'm going to say, national rejuvenation and a response to what the scholars within China have been calling Chinese IR theory. They've majorly banked upon, say, three primary schools of thoughts in some sense, if one could divide that. And we have scholars like Wang Jiangli and Barry Buzan who looked at that entire John Fairbank school of thought, in which sense they look at China's growth and rejuvenation, not really rejuvenation, but growth and trajectory of China's rise in terms of tributary systems. And you have a second school of thought which is more structural in its approach, originating from Tsinghua school. Yan Shuitung and others are actually writing a lot in that sense. The third one is, of course, linking the entire rise to a contemporary Chinese foreign policy, which draws upon historical thought, ancient thought, and looks at modern diplomacy, so on and so forth. So is there a kind of, this book basically pitches itself out there and provides an answer to, or provides a counter narrative to these three school of thoughts in some sense. I feel that the next volume could sort of begin with this particular proposition that all that has been said, and it is this is what the book actually does. It highlights the gaps in all of these three school of thoughts without really putting it together in a chapter in one place per se. But that could well be the strength, as well as maybe a clarion call to the scholars in China to sort of respond to it directly once you have a second phase in the unfolding in this book. I'll stop myself here so that we have more questions from the floor, and I would like to have a sustained engagements with the authors and the editors on this issue. But here I'll stop. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tiwari. So we have a couple of viewers who kind of sent us their questions. So I think I'll just read out the entire bunch of the questions, and then Dr. Jebin can answer them or redirect them at the other co-panelists. Shashidhar has a question. How successful has China been in using e-commerce as a tool of rural revitalization? The other question is directed for Dr. Jacob. China is a good example of how autocracies can innovate They might have begun by stealing, but now they are focusing on building up expertise of their own. Is it a matter of investing in basic sciences and social sciences? Is that where India lags behind? There's another question. It is seen that the political space for debate in China is shrinking. What will be the impact of this on innovation in economic sectors? And Shantanu has a question. To what extent is the century of humiliation still a factor in Chinese foreign policy, especially in terms of making sure that history does not repeat itself? So I think we can start with this first round.
Right. Thank you, Kalpit, and thank you, Ritusha, for those very thoughtful comments on the book. I think, Ritusha, let me start with answering Ritusha's questions. I think on issues on the margins, I think that's a very useful framing question of labor, for example. In fact, we had sort of commissioned, thought of commissioning a chapter on labor, but it just did not work out. Edited volumes are much more ambitious than they finally turn out, as we all know. But one of the chapters that we did want to look at was, for example, private security contractors, on the Belt and Road projects. So that's one. On the issue of gender, I think it's a very important question. China has, by no stretch of the imagination, a feminist foreign policy, and it's very unlikely that it will have in the current structure. You can just look at the Politburo. There are no women, or there is a woman, but there is never a Politburo standing committee member that's a woman. But interestingly, I think it's an insight from Africa, studies of Chinese migrants in Africa, that women entrepreneurs in Africa, Chinese women entrepreneurs, have much more agency, much more freedom, and they often find it easier or better to live in Africa, work in Africa, and they do not want to go back to China because they find their life restricted in China from a gender dimension. And so what impact that will have is something that is worth looking at. Now, just very quickly, Fu Ying, a former Chinese diplomat, a lady diplomat, very well known, comments often on US-China relations. So it does not necessarily mean that women can bring a genuine touch, in this foreign policy. So that doesn't happen because she sold the Americans a lemon, promising that China wouldn't militarize the South China Sea. But that's not how things turned out. An important question Ritusha asks is about what phase of the national rejuvenation are we looking at? And that's a very difficult question to answer because, China is constantly in a state of revolution or rejuvenation every few decades. So, to answer the question of a crisis of faith, I think it's particularly useful to be in this new phase of national rejuvenation because it, in a way, is flexible enough to address questions of crises of faith. So Xi Jinping is constantly nimble. He and his people are nimble and answering questions as they come. So in terms of what is the impact on global governance, I would say it's China's way or the highway as far as the Chinese are concerned. It's a form of might is right, but perhaps a little more with an emphasis on a little more culture, which is why the Chinese sort of try putting a lot of emphasis on soft power, on a Chinese model, how Chinese are different from the Westerners, etc. But, it's just at the root of it, it's all the same. Might is right. Another very important question is about the connection between IR theory, Chinese IR theory and national rejuvenation. Well, first of all, it's a bit of a contradiction in terms to say Chinese IR theory because theory is supposed to be universal. But I think what, we sort of hint at or sort of stress without saying IR theory is that all theory for the Chinese would be instrumental. It's all about serving the ends of the Communist Party, right? So I don't think we will get particularly, we will go very far trying to look at Chinese IR theory because ultimately it is a servant of the Communist Party. To the other questions, thank you from the audience. I did try answering some of them, but I'd like to sort of take on very quickly on the question of century of humiliation. This is something the Chinese trot out every time they want to put pressure on a foreign country. but it's entirely within the control of the Communist Party to switch on the tap or switch off the tap on this narrative of century humiliation. Equally important, autocracies cannot innovate. Again, this is a misnomer. The Chinese, the Russians have all managed to show that vaccines come out in the US, they come out in the UK, but the vaccines are also coming out in Russia and in China. So it's not as if autocracies can't innovate. It's a question of investments, and the Chinese do that a lot in social sciences as well as in the sciences. Thank you. Over to you, Kalpit.
Yeah, we've reached the end of our session today, and I think do you want to have does any of the panelists want to say something just about 30 seconds before we kind of end?
Okay, may I?
Yes.
I would like to respond to Ritusha's comments. Well, actually, feminist diplomacy and representation of female politicians within the Chinese Communist Party is an interesting question, because some of the female students just approached me and want to write about it. So I think my question is, how are we going to interpret and define the representation of female in authoritarian regimes? How much does it matter? Because we are not talking about this or discuss about this in a democratic setting. So under authoritarian regime, actually everyone is, unless you are on the top tier of the management, actually it doesn't matter, right? So how are we going to, if you check the trend, actually in recent years, the number of female Chinese Communist members, the proportion is going up. Okay, but what does that mean? Does that mean that the Chinese Communist Party are trying to promote more of the female rights, or how we're going to interpret this? I think is something that we can see this more in the comparative sense.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Liu.
I would. May I? Yeah.
Yes.
I would like to
30
respond
seconds.
to that question on rural vitalization, which is about e-commerce, the success of e-commerce in rural vitalization in China. So to whosoever asked that question, I would like to tell them that e-commerce domestically has been very successful in China, because a lot of members who are members of the CPC, who are also legislators of CPPCC, this China's People's Consultative Conference, they all are also online retailers. For example, 58.com, JD.com, Sunding.com. These are all examples of the online retailers who are engaging in rural industries and who are interested in developing agribusiness. So when Li Keqiang in his 2015 work report had specified on Internet plus agriculture, it has been very well taken by not just Xi Jinping but various members of CPC, and who are interested in encouraging that China's connecting urban consumer and the rural producer through these online retailing factors. So domestically it is very successful. Internationally it is yet to begin, but yet we can say that at a foreign policy level it can begin, because there are a lot of private enterprises who are initiating this entire rural vitalization at the global level, and there are numerous small number of deals happening. So domestically it is successful. Globally, I think it is almost on the way forward of being successful. Thank you.
Okay. Any final comments, Dr. Jacob?
So yeah, just finally I'd like to thank my fellow panelists and Ritusha again for those very thoughtful comments and for the questions from the audience. And my thanks to you too, Kalpit, and to the ORF for hosting us. I will keep in mind Ritusha's idea of a second volume, but I want to take a break after COVID year. But what I'd like to sort of say is that a colleague and I are putting together a special issue, two special issues on the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China for the journal China Report from the Institute of Chinese Studies. This is going to come out in 2022. So that's something that I hope people can look forward to. Thank you so much. Kalpit.
Thank you all the panelists, and we've completely run out of time. We've come to the end of our session, and thank you everyone, all the participants who logged in for today's book discussion. Stay tuned for many more such interesting sessions that we will have on the ORF platform. Thank you so much.